abbiamo condiviso l'idea di un'Europa molto diversa da quella di oggi.
Dire Black Lives Matter significa non rimandare più la riforma della cittadinanza.
My name is Madeline Baines. I'm an American, but I moved to Italy in 2014 when I was only 11 years old. I never knew or understood what racism really was until moving to Italy. I remember in 6th grade going to a friend's house and seeing pictures of Mussolini everywhere, and thinking to myself like, wait, people still like this guy? As I got older, and especially when I started high school, I saw just how terrible racism was in Italy. For one, I never saw a black person in a job position, but I would see them at my bus stop or walking around town, and I always thought to myself, I wonder if they are even given a chance to get a job, or if they are discriminated against from the beginning. I watched my religion teacher say how we should never date a black person because our parents wouldn't approve and they would get mad. I watched my history teacher tell my friend of Middle Eastern ethnicity to not wear black to school because that makes him look like he is a part of ISIS. But what is the root of this problem? Italian society has ignored racial discrimination in its own country ever since Italy colonized northeastern Africa in the late 19th century. Racist governmental practices, such as ignoring racist attacks in the judicial system and eliminating governmental roles working towards eliminating discrimination, have led to a society that condones widespread racism, evidenced by economic and cultural discrimination, as well as violent attacks on minorities. The Italian media, rather than highlighting these issues, has largely ignored racism, passively promoting the myth that racism in Italy doesn't exist, and thereby rendering meaningful change difficult. All of these factors led me to come up with my project, Cambiamo l'Italia, Racism and Social Change in Italy. I want to start this podcast by talking about the beginning of racism and why it even is a thing. In Europe, during the late 17th century, theories and ideas about racism in Europe began contextualizing. Philosophers such as Georges Louis Buffon and Charles de Montesquieu had the idea that racism was conditioned by environmental factors, for example, climate and geography, and they, therefore, regarded the differences between various people as purely accidental, written in Gutman's article. This idea was later transformed into the organic theory by Johann Gottfried von Herder. This theory stated that there was a gap between different races caused by nature. Using these theories, scientists found and fabricated certain scientific phenomena in order to confirm their racist ideals. For example, a Dutch anatomist, Peter Camper, did a study that consisted of measuring facial and cranial measurements of black apes and Europeans, which displayed an orderly progress from monkeys through blacks to average Europeans, according to Gutman's writing. These sorts of racial studies only furthered racism, as black people were essentially seen as behind white people in terms of evolution. Many people in Europe also welcomed these racist scientific explanations because they could already see a difference in their skin color, so they assumed there must be other differences as well. During the 18th century, racist ideas spread. For example, in 1839, at the Ethnological Society of Paris, a group of political figures from a variety of countries, written in Gutman's article, declared that races differed from one another by their, quote, physical organization, their moral, mental facilities, and their historical tradition. Statements such as these further separated Europeans from black people, as they spoke not only of physical differences, but how also of cultural and mental differences. As we progress through the 18th century, more and more essays, studies, and research start to emerge. One being the essay on the inequality of human races published in 1855 by Gobineau. In this essay, he concluded that human advancement can only occur when there are superior and inferior races. He defined three races: whites, the noblest of them all, yellows, who are only capable of trade and focus too much on materialistic items, and lastly blacks, who cannot be a part of civil society and needed to be controlled. Although this essay was not extremely influential, it still gave an idea of what racism would turn out to be in the future. Interestingly, while racism was becoming more prominent in most of Europe, Italy did not accept these ideas as much. As they were Catholic, discrimination went against their faith, making them less racist in reality. So then how did Italy become so racist? To start, from 1890 to 1941, Italy colonized Libya, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia. They did this mostly to gain prestige in the international realm. Although the colonization of these countries did not satisfy their religious needs, the Italians saw this as a necessary investment to gain respect from other countries. The article, Africa, Italian Colonies, also draws attention to the fact that, quote, Italy's colonization in Africa began to draw distinctions between people of different races. Italians began to think of themselves as somehow different from colonized Africans and Arabs. While this colonization was happening, another factor came into play. Anti-Semitism started to serve as what Gutman said, quote, the breeding ground for racist views. This was because they did in fact live and interact with Europeans, but they had a different culture and language, making Europeans look at them as out of place. In the beginning, Jewish people lived primarily in ghettos, making them insignificant to other Europeans. This changed, though, when they were given the same rights as everyone else. When given these rights, they did not move out of the ghettos and become more like other Europeans. Instead, they did move out of the ghettos, but they didn't change their culture, and they accumulated wealth. This made them seem like they were a threat to other Europeans. While this was not the only cause of racism today, it is what started widespread Jewish hate in Europe, particularly in Germany. This anti-Semitism across Europe eventually influenced Italy. And in 1938, quote, the Italian fascist government unveiled its policy of racial anti-Semitism, written by Bernardini. Mussolini then, of course, followed along with Hitler, increasing fascism and anti-Semitism in Italy throughout World War II. In regard to the Italian people, though, this was not traditional racism based on biology or appearances. Instead, it was based on ideological and political influence by the fascist party. Now we can jump another bit forward in time to 1990, when The Economist, a well-known newspaper, wrote an article about why racism was becoming even more prominent in many parts of Western Europe, such as Italy. They gave 3 core reasons why these countries were becoming even more discriminatory at the beginning of the 90s. The first being increased immigration from third world countries such as those in Africa. These new immigrants were seen either as criminals or as job stealers. The second reason The Economist gave was growing nationalism and Europeanism. In Italy, there were norms and pride in such norms, just like any other country. If and when immigrants or people of different races had different ways of living, Italians saw this as an inadequate way to live on their land. The third and final reason was polarization in politics. We see the event of polarization or gravitating towards one political party or another, and just following the leader, even in modern politics today. The polarization at a time meant people would search out opposition and defend their parties and leaders, even if they enforced racist ideals. I believe these reasons were valid for the growth of modern racism in Italy, as well as correct for what is happening today in modern Italy. Now that we have covered the history leading up to the 90s of racism in Italy, I want to take a look at Italy today. I think the best way to explain it is to talk about some data collected in 2019 by a reputable Italian survey company, the SWG Project. They surveyed a large group of Italians about their perceptions of racism and discrimination in Italy. The first question they asked was whether or not they thought acts of racism or discrimination are justifiable. 69% of the sample answered no, but 31% said yes. Even though 31% is a smaller number, It does mean that in this group, which the survey company is trying to generalize to the greater population, 31% of people still think that there are times when racism and discrimination is okay, which in itself shows a lack of respect for people of different ethnicities. The survey then asks whether or not they think Italy has a problem concerning racism. 41% of the people said mostly not and none at all. Again, we see that 41% of the people in this group think racism is not a problem, when 31% of people still believe it is okay to commit acts of racism or discrimination. The blatant racism and ignorance when it comes to the topic displayed by some people in the survey does not only come from the general population, but from politicians as well. Only 11 years ago, the European Affairs Minister of Italy, Andrea Ronchi, said Italy was, quote, the most welcoming country in Europe. In regards to racism, he then said, quote, in Italy there is no racism. It does not exist. It is an accusation made by people who do not know Italy. The minister said this days after a, quote, violent attack that forced more than 1,000 African farm workers to flee a town in the south of his country, Ronchi. These attacks were clashes between Italians and immigrants. They were so violent that over 1,000 immigrants decided to leave their town because they were scared for their lives. So I questioned to myself, how could someone see such blatant racism that left 31 immigrants injured and 1,000 fleeing and not see the problem of racism? On July 5th, 2016, Emmanuel Chirinamdi was murdered. Emmanuel was an asylum seeker from Nigeria. He and his wife came across the Mediterranean to escape the violence in their village in Nigeria. After arriving in Italy, they lived in a small beach town near the city of Palermo. One day, while Emmanuel and his wife Cinieri were on a walk, two men began to insult the couple because of their race. One of the men grabbed Cinieri and called her, quote, una scimmia africana, in English, an African monkey. When her husband tried to help, he was violently beaten with a street sign, put into a coma, and later died. This event was very obviously a racist hate crime and shows that in Italy, people of color can be killed by just going on a walk in their own town. The attacker, Amedeo Mancini, was part of a political group called Casa Pound. Casa Pound is a neo-fascist political group. Its main goal is to promote fascism, but they promote racism as well, which is reflected by this member's actions. One can make the argument that the couple was attacked because they were asylum seekers, immigrants, and new to Italy. I believe this attack, though, like many other attacks against people of color, was due to race. I continue to believe this because of cases like that of also Cecile Kayenge. Cecile Kayenge was 19 when she immigrated to Italy from the Democratic Republic of Congo to go to medical school. Over the decades, she gained some political popularity, often speaking on issues of race, and was eventually elected the Minister of Integration. Cecile, in an interview, said, quote, the fact that there is a new Ministry of Integration is a sign that this government needs to take a different approach to immigration, one of reception and openness. She herself has, quote, deftly used her post to expand awareness and conservation on the subject, Povoledo. Even though Mrs. Kayenge was making history as she was, quote, Italy's first black national official, Povoledo, many people did not support her. She started to receive many death threats, and even a city council member of Padua said that she should be raped. Most of the hate came from the Northern League, which is a very anti-immigrant political Republican party. These two cases go to show that any person of color, no matter their immigration or citizen status, their class, their profession, are in danger of physical or verbal attacks and threats at any moment. Although I believe racism in Italy is motivated by the color of your skin, one lady I interviewed thought differently. Michela Santiccioli, a black woman who was born in England but moved to a small town in Italy, Cortona, when she was only 3 years old, has now lived in Cortona for 30 years. While Michela believes racism exists everywhere, she has not personally experienced much racism. She too believes racism comes from a different place than where I think it comes from.
Oh, kids can be mean. So yes, I was, they were making fun of my hair and of my skin color, but that was like kindergarten school,
Right.
or yeah,
Mhm.
till I was like 12 maybe. But
Okay.
it was more like, I they say something about me and I would say something about them, but it wasn't real racism.
Right.
Here it's more about, the immigrants, the real immigrants that come here with the boat. So people, but people in Israel, they're not racist. They're more scared, I think. Scared about, these poor people coming here, and they think, that they can, do something bad to them. But I don't think it's real racism.
Through this podcast, I believe it's important to let people draw their own conclusions from my research, and therefore I think it is important to share different stories, experiences, and perspectives. I believe Michela is right in the sense that racism can stem from immigration, but I respectfully disagree with her in the sense that I think racism is rooted deeper than that in Italy. While we are on the topic of immigration, I think it is important to examine this topic as it is a crucial factor when it comes to racism. Immigration to Italy is extremely confusing. The process to become a resident is very difficult, and becoming a citizen is close to impossible, especially for people of color. Many immigrants of color come on boats across the Mediterranean. These boats are not safe, they are overcrowded, and the journey alone kills many immigrants and refugees. When they do reach Italy, though, they are not greeted pleasantly. Instead, they are judged based on a variety of factors, which Professor Gaio Giuliani from the University of Coimbra in Portugal comments on. Listen to the clip.
So when we talk about women and children disembarking, rescuing boats, speaking about migrants, we have a certain...
So when we talk about women and children disembarking from rescue boats, speaking about migrants, we have a certain representation of these bodies. When we talk about men, depending if they are black or brown, if they are Muslim or not, if they are straight or perceived as gay, or as transgender or transsexual, we have different kinds of representations, and they insist, let's say, on the broader representation of the racialized threat in a different way.
A broader representation of the racialized threat in a different way.
The laws, too, are in fact very complicated and are always changing. The most important thing an immigrant needs to move to Italy, though, is a permesso di soggiorno. This document is a sort of residency card. The process for obtaining it, though, is long and has to be renewed often, meaning immigrants have to constantly be making appointments, filling out paperwork, paying fees for years. In addition to the difficulty of the immigration process, Italy's latest immigration report, Il rapporto sull'asilo e immigrazione in Italia, written in 2018, states that permesso di soggiornos will no longer be given out for humanitarian reasons. The report also states that if one is in immediate danger, subject to domestic abuse, or needs medical help, they can still get a permesso. But saying that there is no more humanitarian permissos makes the process of applying for these other types much more difficult, and it makes immigration offices less likely to approve certain requests. The reason for so much hate against immigrants goes back to fear and polarization of politics. An example of this can be seen of a video taken of Matteo Salvini outside a refugee center in Italy, who is the former deputy prime minister of Italy, who directly relates immigration with terrorism. Here's the clip.
I repeat, we have planned what we will do in the government to block immigration, therefore to block Islamic terrorism. All of this goes to say that we have a very different idea of what Europe would look like compared to what it looks like today.
So let's say, like what Michele Santiccioli thinks, that racism is not the problem, immigration is. Then wouldn't that count for all immigrants? We have so far looked at a few stories of immigrants of color, so let's look at white immigrants for a change. Hannah Efron is a white American from California. She attended part of her college years in Italy and then ended up marrying an Italian and now lives and works in Italy full time. Here's a clip from when I talked to her about her immigration experience.
But do you think, so you don't think that any Italians have necessarily discriminated against you outside of state offices, just kind of people maybe that live around you or that have been your boss or coworkers?
No, not at all.
Throughout the whole interview, she talked about how she was not discriminated against and has had a positive experience, which differs greatly from what immigrants of color have experienced in Italy. Again, somebody could simply make the argument that Hannah is American and is for that reason for which she is not discriminated against as an immigrant. So then let's look at one last story. Nicole Phillips spent her entire life in the United States, but during her junior year of college, she did a semester abroad in Florence, Italy. One day, while at the beach at Cinque Terre, her friend and a random Italian man got into an argument. Here is part of her story written in the New York Times. The rest of us stood, watched for a minute, until he grabbed her like a rag doll. She had such a tiny frame, his hand seemed to fully wrap around her arm. The other woman did nothing, so I quickly stepped in. When I gave his arm a solid punch, he finally let her go. I looked around and saw a sea of white faces staring on the packed beach. Not a single one had made a move to help. As my group walked away, one of the women made an observation I'll never forget. "Did you hear that? He just called you a disgusting black woman." This is only one part of her story, and it is sadly one of the many racist encounters that she had while living in Italy. Nicole was not an immigrant. She was an African American spending a few months in Italy. She was judged, though, even as a student at a well-known university. This story, in my opinion, shows that racism is not reliant on immigration, status, social class, financial status. She was judged on her race and that alone. Now that we have addressed the topic of immigration and how it plays into the topic of the whole, I want to move on to another interesting thing to understand. Nicole Phillips in her article is clear about how she experienced much more racism in Italy than in America. But is this true for just her or everyone else? To address this question, I want to look back at Michele's and Hannah's interviews and compare their differing opinions. On one side, Hannah Efron, a white immigrant originally from California, says she never saw real racism until moving to Italy, much like Nicole Phillips' opinion. Here's the clip.
They have these ideas that have been around for centuries. And so they have this idea about a certain thing and it doesn't really change. And if it does, it takes a really long time. So coming here, it was kind of a shock to see racism in a way that I hadn't seen it previously to that.
On the other hand, Michele Santiccioli, a black immigrant from England, has the opposite opinion of Hannah and Nicole. Here is the next clip.
So do you think racial discrimination is a problem in Italy?
So yes, but not, not on my personal experience, but I think it is an issue in whole Italy.
Right.
Not, if I can say this, not as much as in America,
right,
but yet there is in Italy also.
To answer the question of whether or not racism is worse in Italy or the US, I think it would be extremely difficult. So let's start off by saying racism in Italy and America is just different. Nadisha Yuyangoda, a black woman who lives in Italy, writes how she thinks systematic racism exists in Italy like how it exists in America. But she says, quote, I think that racism is more complex on this side, or the Italian side, of the Atlantic. She writes about how the differences of where racism comes from in the two countries are what make the topic of racism different in Italy and the US. This topic is further explained by Gaia Giuliani.
So, it is very hard to compare the two contexts because
it is very hard to compare the two contexts because we didn't have slavery, we didn't have segregation, we didn't have civil rights movements, we didn't have the 11th Amendment, we didn't have all the black and female struggles of the 60s and 70s. There is not a comparison. It can be interesting, but also very dangerous when you borrow plans and forms of organizations which are the result of the political context without translating it into the new context, where you want the plans, claims, and political organizations to be successful in terms of anti-racism and civil rights in a different national culture.
Forms of organization which are the result of a particular historical context without translating it into the context where you want these labels, claims, and organization to be successful.
What's also very interesting about racism in Italy is the fact that last summer, when Black Lives Matter protests started in the United States, they started to happen in Italy too. After the BLM protests started to happen in Italy, I wondered, why are Italians protesting racism in America when they have never had a problem with racism in their own country? An article in ID written by author Bellamy says one possible reason for this occurrence could be how the Italian media heavily covered the story of George Floyd and the BLM protest happening in the United States, but then usually failed to cover racist acts that actually happen in Italy. This lack of coverage can mean ignorance when it comes to racism in Italy. Even if the majority of Italians are not explicitly racist, they are not anti-racist either, which of course leads to a lack of activism regarding the subject. The Washington Journal even quotes Luca Palladini, an activist associated with an anti-discrimination group, I Sentinelli di Milano, saying, quote, "We need a much deeper debate on these issues of racism in Italy. As a society, our cultural limitations on these matters are evident right now. Without activism, media coverage, nothing will change. People need to force change, which is slowly starting to happen, but obviously needs to continue to happen on a higher scale." Saying an issue needs to be fixed and that change needs to occur is easy to say, but how does change come about? I think the most realistic solution that I have heard has been by Professor Gaia Giuliani. Here are some of her thoughts.
Prima di tutto, per avere un cambiamento bisogna che il problema sia visibile a tutti.
First of all, to have the change, the problem must be visible to everyone. Institutions don't change by themselves. Institutions change because there are movements that make them change. Therefore, we need more activism, stronger alliances, decisive fronts, and certainly continue on the road, which is a long road that brings together Italians of color with immigrants.
Sicuramente continuare sulla strada, che è una strada abbastanza nuova, che mette insieme italiani
That is, some people say we need to enter the mainstream media, from television to online and offline journals, and try to take that space. Other people say let it be that space that is impenetrable, and we create new spaces. So new independent newspapers, new television channels, multiply on digital, and build programs that make these movements pass. I repeat, we have planned that we will do in the government to block immigration, therefore to block Islamic terrorism. All of this goes to say that we have a very different idea of what Europe will look like compared to what it looks like today.
All of this means that it needs to come from the people. It comes from a newspaper covering the stories of people of color in Italy. It comes from documentaries, podcasts, articles, books, research, but it also comes from you, the people. As Elie Wiesel said, there may be times when we are powerless to prevent injustice, but there must never be a time when we fail to protest. Thank you for listening to my podcast. I hope I revealed a part of Italy seldom talked about. I would like to thank Mr. Halp, Mrs. Barden, Mrs. Alley, Mr. Payne, Vaughn, Starr, and all my fellow GSDers for your help and support. I would like to also thank all of the people I interviewed: Hannah Efron, Michela Santiccioli, and Gaia Giuliani. This was my Global Scholars Diploma project, Cambiamo l'Italia, Racism and Social Change in Italy.